Marcus Williams adjusted his tie one last time before stepping into Romano's, one of downtown Chicago's most expensive Italian restaurants. The federal judge had agreed to meet his colleague's niece for what was supposed to be a simple dinner, nothing serious, just two professionals getting acquainted. But what he witnessed in the next 30 seconds would change everything he thought he knew about dignity, class, and what really matters in life. At a corner table near the window, a woman in a bright yellow dress was speaking loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "I mean, seriously, David? A janitor? My friends told me you worked in the courthouse, but they didn't mention you were the guy who empties the trash cans." Her laugh was sharp, cutting through the ambient dinner conversation like a blade. Marcus froze at the hostess station. He recognized the man sitting across from her immediately, David Rodriguez, the night cleaner who had been working at the federal courthouse for nearly 8 years. But Marcus saw wasn't the quiet, respectful man who always nodded politely when they passed in the hallways. This David looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his untouched plate of pasta. "Listen, Sarah." David's voice was barely audible from where Marcus stood. "I know it's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I support my daughter. I pay my bills. Support your daughter." Sarah's voice pitched higher. "On a cleaner's salary? What kind of life can you possibly give her? McDonald's for every birthday. Walmart clothes for school." The hostess approached Marcus with a practiced smile. "Good evening, sir. Table for one." Marcus held up a finger, his attention completely absorbed by the scene unfolding before him. He had presided over countless cases involving dignity and respect, but he had never seen someone's character assassinated so publicly, so cruelly. David was speaking again, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "My daughter Elena is in her second year at Northwestern University. She's studying pre-med, and she's never wanted for anything important. We may not eat at places like this every night, but Northwestern," Sarah interrupted with a derisive snort. "Please, community college maybe. You're telling me you're paying Northwestern tuition by mopping floors?" What happened next made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. David didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a small photograph, placing it gently on the white tablecloth between them. "This is Elena at her Dean's List ceremony last semester," David said quietly. "She's graduating magna cum laude next year. She got there because she watched me leave for work every night at 11 p.m. and come home every morning at 7 a.m. She learned that there's no shame in working hard for the people you love." But if David thought his words would touch something human in Sarah, he was wrong. She glanced at the photo for barely a second before pushing it back across the table. That's actually kind of sad, David. You've convinced yourself that struggling is noble. My last boyfriend was an investment banker. We went to the Maldives for my birthday. The one before that was a surgeon. What are you going to show me? The supply closet where you keep the industrial cleaners. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. In his 23 years on the federal bench, he had seen the worst of humanity: corruption, violence, betrayal. But there was something about watching a good man being systematically torn down by someone who had never learnt the difference between having money and having worth that made his blood pressure spike. "Sarah, I think maybe we should..." David started to stand up. "Oh, you're leaving. Perfect. This saves me the awkward conversation about why this will never work out." She didn't even look up from her phone as she spoke. "The Uber's already on its way. You can get the check, right? I mean, this was your idea." Marcus watched David's face carefully. There it was, just a flicker of something that looked like relief mixed with profound sadness. The man had dignity, even in defeat. But what Sarah did next crossed a line that Marcus didn't even know existed. As David reached for his wallet to pay for a meal he had barely touched, Sarah spoke loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Next time someone sets me up on a blind date, I'm going to ask for references and a credit report. God, imagine if my friends saw me here with the help. Something ignited in Marcus's chest, a fury so pure and focused it surprised him. He had spent decades maintaining judicial composure, weighing words carefully, never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. But watching this woman reduce a hard-working father to the help unlocked something he hadn't felt since law school. When he had punched a classmate for making racist jokes about his study group, David was counting out cash from a worn wallet, his movements deliberate and careful. Even in humiliation, the man was going to leave a proper tip. Marcus could see it in his posture. David Rodriguez was a man who understood that how you treat people, especially when they're serving you, says everything about who you really are. Sarah was still talking, apparently addressing her phone, but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can you believe some people actually think cleaning toilets is a career? Like, get some ambition, you know." That was it. Marcus Williams, federal judge, pillar of Chicago's legal community, recipient of the Illinois State Bar Association's Distinguished Service Award, walked directly to their table. "Excuse me." His voice carried the same authority that had commanded silence in courtrooms for over 2 decades. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Sarah looked up, and Marcus saw her eyes do that quick calculation that certain people do when they encounter someone whose suitor costs more than their rent. David, on the other hand, looked mortified, not because he was ashamed of himself, but because his private humiliation was about to become even more public. "Oh, hi there." Sarah's voice immediately shifted to what she probably thought was her charming register. "I'm Sarah. Are you dining alone? You could join us, but we were actually just—" "I'm Judge Marcus Williams of the Northern District Federal Court," Marcus said, his words precise and measured, "and I believe I owe this gentleman an apology." Both Sarah and David stared at him in confusion, but for completely different reasons. Marcus turned to David, his voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "Mr. Rodriguez, I've seen you at the courthouse for years, and I've never taken the time to properly thank you for your service. That was inexcusable on my part." David's eyes widened. "Judge Williams, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Marcus pulled out the third chair at their table and sat down uninvited, his presence commanding the space like a gravitational field. "Because what I just witnessed here tells me everything I need to know about character. And I need to make something very clear to both of you." Sarah's phone had disappeared into her purse. She was sitting up straighter, her predatory confidence suddenly replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. Marcus looked directly at her, his judicial gaze unwavering. "Ma'am, you just spent the last 15 minutes degrading a man whose daughter attends one of the finest universities in the country, whose work ethic puts most people to shame, and whose integrity is something you clearly wouldn't recognize if it introduced itself and granted you a business card." The restaurant around them had grown quiet. Other diners were pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. But what Marcus said next would leave Sarah completely speechless and change David Rodriguez's life forever. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marcus continued, never taking his eyes off Sarah's increasingly pale face, "I have a proposition for you. But first, I think this young lady needs to understand exactly who she just called the help." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. David looked confused. Sarah looked terrified. And Marcus Williams felt more alive than he had in years. What the federal judge revealed next would expose the truth so shocking that Sarah would sit in stunned silence for the first time all evening. And David would discover that sometimes the universe has a way of evening the scales when you least expect it. Underscored Marcus Williams leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in the way that had become his trademark during particularly important court proceedings. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as he prepared to deliver what would be the most satisfying moment of his judicial career, not in a courtroom, but at a dinner table where justice was about to be served in the most unexpected way. Sarah, isn't it? Marcus's voice carried that particular tone that lawyers recognized as the calm before a legal storm. Before I tell you about Mr. Rodriguez here, I'm curious about something. What exactly do you do for work? Sarah's confidence flickered back momentarily. I'm in marketing, digital marketing actually. I work for a boutique firm downtown. We handle social media campaigns for luxury brands. She straightened her shoulders, clearly thinking she was back on solid ground. Ah, marketing, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Tell me, what's your annual salary, if you don't mind me asking? Just ballpark. The question caught Sarah off guard. Why would you? That's pretty personal, don't you think? You've spent the evening discussing Mr. Rodriguez's financial situation quite publicly, Marcus replied smoothly. I assumed you were comfortable with that level of transparency. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Williams, you really don't need to. But Marcus held up a gentle hand. Please, David, I think this is important. He turned back to Sarah, whose face was now showing the first signs of genuine uncertainty. Roughly speaking, Sarah, are we talking 40,000, 60,000? I make 75,000 a year, she said defensively, her voice just a little too loud, plus bonuses and benefits. It's a very competitive field. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he were considering a complex legal argument. 75,000. That's respectable for someone your age. And how long have you been in this position? 2 years, Sarah replied, though she was beginning to look like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. 2 years. Marcus repeated the words as if they held great significance. And before that, I was getting established. Entry-level positions, you know how it is. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus Williams had spent decades reading people to defendants, witnesses, attorneys trying to hide crucial information. And right now, Sarah was broadcasting her insecurity like a neon sign in Times Square. Of course, Marcus said gently, we all start somewhere. Now David, would you mind sharing what you make annually? I know it's personal, but I think it might be educational. David looked mortified. Judge, I don't think. It's okay. Marcus's voice was reassuring. Trust me on this one. David took a deep breath. I make 42,000 base salary from the courthouse. But I also do private cleaning contracts on weekends, offices, a few residential clients. Altogether, maybe 58,000 a year. Sarah couldn't hide her smirk. See? I told you, but that's not the whole story, is it, David? Marcus interrupted, his eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. David looked confused. I'm not sure what you mean, Judge. Marcus Williams smiled, the same smile he wore when he was about to overturn a case that had seemed hopeless. Well, let me fill in some gaps. Sarah, you've been very focused on David's job as a cleaner, but what you don't know is that Mr. Rodriguez here has been taking night classes for the past 6 years. Sarah's smirk wavered slightly. Business administration, with a focus on property management. Graduated summa cum laude from DePaul last spring, didn't you, David? David's face flushed red. Judge, how did you? I make it my business to know about people who work in my courthouse, Marcus continued. But there's more. Sarah, you mentioned that David couldn't possibly afford Northwestern tuition for his daughter. What you don't know is that Mr. Rodriguez here owns 3 apartment buildings on the south side. Blur drained from Sarah's face so quickly that Marcus briefly wondered if she might faint. 3 buildings, Marcus repeated, savoring each word. Purchased strategically over the past 80 years, with savings from his cleaning work, and renovated largely by his own hands. Current market value, just over $2 million. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time all evening, she was completely speechless. But Marcus wasn't finished. You see, Sarah, while you were judging David for cleaning toilets, he was building an empire. While you were worried about what your friends might think about dating the help, David was teaching his daughter that there's no shame in honest work. No matter how humble it might seem. David looked stunned. Judge Williams, I had no idea you knew about the property investments. David, I've been watching you for years. You think I didn't notice you reading real estate law books during your breaks? You think I missed the fact that you always asked intelligent questions when courthouse maintenance issues came up? Marcus chuckled. I've been wondering when you were going to make your move. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The man she'd spent the evening humiliating, calling the help, mocking, for his lack of ambition, was worth more than she would probably make in 20 years. But the judge wasn't done delivering his verdict. Now, Sarah, let me tell you why I really came over here. Marcus's voice took on that courtroom authority that had commanded respect for decades. I didn't just overhear your conversation by accident. I was supposed to meet someone for dinner tonight, my colleague's niece, actually. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell who works in marketing. The blood rushed back to Sarah's face all at once, turning her complexion a deep crimson. That's right, Marcus continued. You're my blind date. And after witnessing your performance tonight, I can safely say this is the shortest relationship of my 62 years on this planet. The silence that followed was so complete that the clink of silverware from neighboring tables sounded like gunshots. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. But here's what's really interesting, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. David, I came here tonight to meet Sarah because my colleague thought we might have things in common. Professional success, similar values, that sort of thing. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Turns out, I do have something in common with someone at this table. Just not the person I expected. David was staring at Marcus with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. You see, David, I didn't become a federal judge overnight. I grew up in Detroit, in a neighborhood where my mother cleaned offices at night to pay for my school clothes. My father worked 2 jobs, grocery store during the day, security guard at night, and every evening they sat with me at our kitchen table and made sure I understood that hard work wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his business card, placing it on the table in front of David. I've been looking for someone to help me manage some property investments of my own. Someone who understands the business, who has proven they can handle responsibility, and who knows the value of honest work. He smiled. The salary starts at $120,000 a year. David's eyes widened in shock. Judge, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Marcus replied, because I have a feeling that your real estate career is just getting started. Sarah had been sitting in stunned silence through this entire exchange, but now she found her voice. Wait, you're offering him a job? Just like that? Marcus turned to her with the same expression he wore when dismissing frivolous lawsuits. Ma'am, I just watched this man maintain his dignity while you systematically attempted to destroy it. I watched him speak respectfully about his daughter's achievements while you mocked his sacrifice. I watched him prepare to pay for a meal he didn't enjoy, with money he works hard to earn, after being treated like garbage by someone who hasn't accomplished half of what he has. He stood up, his full height commanding the space around their table. Character isn't something you can fake, Sarah, and you've shown me exactly who you are tonight. The judge turned to David one last time. Mr. Rodriguez, I hope you'll consider my offer. And regardless of what you decide, I want you to know something. Your daughter is lucky to have a father who taught her that dignity isn't about what you do for work. It's about how you do whatever work you choose. Marcus pulled out his wallet and placed $200 bills on the table. Dinner's on me, gentlemen. Sarah, your Uber should be here any minute. As the federal judge walked toward the exit, leaving behind a humiliated woman and a stunned janitor who had just discovered that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who remember where they came from. The entire restaurant buzzed with whispered conversations about what they had just witnessed. But the evening surprises weren't over yet. What David Rodriguez would discover in the next 24 hours would prove that some encounters are not coincidental. Their destiny wearing the disguise of chance. David Rodriguez sat in his small but immaculately clean kitchen at 6:47 a.m., staring at the business card that had kept him awake most of the night. The embossed lettering seemed to shimmer in the early morning light filtering through his apartment window. The Honorable Marcus Williams, United States District Judge, Northern District of Illinois. His daughter Elena's voice echoed from her bedroom where she was getting ready for her morning classes. Dad, you're up early even for you. Everything okay? David smiled despite his exhaustion. Elena had inherited his work ethic, but also his mother's intuition. She could read his moods better than anyone. Just thinking, Mia, come have coffee with your old man before you head to campus. What David couldn't tell Elena yet was that everything might be about to change. The job offer, if it was real, would mean more than just financial security. It would mean he could stop working nights, could actually see his daughter graduate without falling asleep from exhaustion, could maybe even take that vacation they'd been talking about for 3 years. But was it real? In the harsh light of morning, the events at Romano's felt almost surreal. Had a federal judge really offered him a 6-figure salary based on witnessing one terrible dinner date? Elena emerged from her bedroom, her Northwestern University sweatshirt wrinkled from sleep, her dark hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn since middle school. At 21, she had her father's steady gaze and her late mother's fierce determination. Dad, you look like you haven't slept. She poured herself coffee from the pot he'd made, adding the 2 sugars and splash of milk she'd preferred since she was 12. What's going on? David held up the business card. Remember how I told you about that blind date last night? The one Aunt Rosa set up. Elena groaned dramatically. Please tell me you're not calling to ask for a second date. Dad, I love Aunt Rosa, but her track record with matchmaking is worse than the Cubs' batting average last season. Despite everything, David laughed. No, Mia. The date was, well, let's just say it didn't go as planned. But something unexpected happened. As David recounted the events of the previous evening, he watched his daughter's expressions change from amusement to anger to complete disbelief. When he finished, Elena sat in stunned silence for nearly a minute. Wait, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Williams, as in the Judge Williams whose decisions I've been studying in my pre-law electives. The one who wrote that landmark ruling on housing discrimination. David nodded. You know him? Dad, he's a legend. Professor Martinez calls him the People's Judge. because of how many times he's ruled in favor of working families against big corporations. Elena's eyes were wide with something approaching awe. And he offered you a job, just like that? I'm not sure if it was serious, David admitted. It was an emotional moment. Maybe he was just trying to make a point to that woman. Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Dad, you're calling him. Today, this morning. Elena, I can't just... Yes, you can. Her voice carried the same authority she'd inherited from him. The tone she used when she was absolutely certain about something. Do you know what this could mean? Not just the money, Dad. The opportunity. The chance to use that business degree you earned by studying until 2 a.m. every night for 6 years. David looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. When had she become so wise? When had she started sounding like the parent in their conversations? What if he changed his mind? David asked quietly. What if it was just ... pity? Elena sat back down and took her father's weathered hands in her own. Dad, I've watched you build something from nothing. I've seen you turn 3 run-down buildings into homes that families are proud to live in. I've watched you solve problems that property management companies with fancy degrees couldn't figure out. She paused, her voice growing softer. But more than that, I've watched you treat every person you meet with respect. From the bank president who approved your first loan to Mrs. Jun from 2B, who pays her rent 2 weeks late every month because her social security check comes at a weird time. David felt his throat tighten. Mira, I just did what felt right. Exactly. And Judge Williams saw that. He saw who you really are, not what that awful woman wanted you to be. Elena squeezed his hands. Dad, this isn't pity. This is recognition. Before David could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at the screen, and his heart stopped. The message was from an unknown number. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Judge Williams. I hope last night's offer didn't seem too impulsive. Would you be available to meet at my chambers this morning at 10 a.m. to discuss the position in detail? If this timing doesn't work, please suggest when would be convenient for you. Williams. Elena, reading over his shoulder, let out a sound that was half laugh, half squeal. Dad, he's serious. He wants to meet you at the courthouse. David stared at the message, his mind racing. The courthouse. His workplace for 8 years, but now potentially in a completely different capacity. The place where he'd mopped floors and emptied trash cans. Where he'd nodded respectfully to judges in the hallways. Where he'd never imagined he'd someday sit across from one of them as an equal. What do I say? David asked, his voice barely audible. Elena grabbed the phone from his hands and started typing. You say yes. And then you go get ready because you have exactly 3 hours to prepare for the most important job interview of your life. Elena. Wait. But she was already sending the message. Judge Williams, I would be honored to meet with you at 10 a.m. Thank you for this opportunity. David Rodriguez. The response came back within 30 seconds. Excellent. Federal Building, 15th floor. Ask for chambers of Judge Williams. Looking forward to our conversation. Elena looked at her father with a mixture of pride and excitement that made his chest swell. Dad, do you realize what just happened? In less than 12 hours you went from being humiliated by some entitled woman to having a federal judge personally recruit you for a job. David shook his head in amazement. I still can't believe it's real. It's real, Dad. And you know what the best part is? You earned it. Not because of luck, not because someone felt sorry for you, but because Judge Williams saw what I have known my whole life, that you're one of the most decent, hard-working, intelligent men in this city. At that moment, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Romano's restaurant. Hello? David answered cautiously. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Michael Torino, the general manager at Romano's. I wanted to call personally to apologize for what you experienced at our restaurant last night." David was confused. "I'm sorry, how did you get my number?" "Judge Williams left his contact information and asked us to reach out to you. He wanted to make sure we understood that what happened was completely unacceptable. We've already spoken with the young woman who was inappropriate, and she's no longer welcome at our establishment." Elena was listening intently, her eyes growing wider by the second. "Mr. Rodriguez," the manager continued, "Judge Williams also mentioned that you might be celebrating some good news soon. When you're ready, we'd like to invite you and your family for dinner as our guests. It's the least we can do." After David hung up, Elena stared at him with something approaching reverence. "Dad, Judge Williams didn't just offer you a job. He made sure that woman faced consequences for how she treated you, and he arranged for the restaurant to apologize. Do you understand what that means?" David was beginning to understand something that went far beyond a job offer or an apology. Judge Williams hadn't just witnessed David's humiliation, he'd recognized something worth defending, something worth investing in. "It means," David said slowly, "that some people still believe in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching." Elena smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "And it means that all those years of you showing me that character matters, that how we treat people matters, that dignity isn't something anyone can take away from us. It all led to this moment." As David headed to his bedroom to prepare for the most important meeting of his life, he couldn't help but think about his late wife, Maria. She had always believed that goodness would be rewarded, that treating people with respect would come back to them somehow. She had been gone for 5 years, but David felt her presence in that moment more strongly than he had since the day she died. What David didn't know was that across town, Judge Williams was already making phone calls that would change not just David's immediate future, but set in motion a series of events that would impact both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. At 9:45 a.m., David Rodriguez stood in the elevator of the federal building, watching the numbers climb toward the 15th floor. He wore his best suit, the navy blue one he'd bought for Elena's high school graduation 3 years ago, and carried a leather portfolio that Elena had insisted he purchased that morning from a second-hand shop downtown. "You're going to meet with a federal judge about a 6-figure job," she had said, practically pushing him out of the store. "You need to look like you belong there." But as the elevator climbed, David wasn't sure he would ever feel like he belonged in the chambers of Judge Marcus Williams. He had cleaned these hallways for 8 years, but he had never imagined walking through them as anything other than the night a janitor. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors opened to reveal a hallway he knew intimately. But instead of wheeling a cart full of cleaning supplies, he was carrying copies of his business degree, his property management certifications, and financial statements for his 3 buildings. Elena had helped him organize everything the night before, treating the preparation like one of her pre-med study sessions. "Mr. Rodriguez." A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and perfectly styled gray hair approached him. "I'm Patricia Chun, Judge Williams' clerk. He's expecting you." David followed her down the familiar hallway, past offices where he had emptied trash cans and vacuumed carpets hundreds of times. But now, walking in his suit behind the judge's clerk, everything looked different somehow, more formal, more intimidating, more important. "Judge Williams is just finishing a conference call," Patricia explained as they approached the heavy wooden door marked with the judge's name. "He should be ready in just a moment. Can I get you coffee? Water?" "Water would be great, thank you," David replied, his mouth suddenly dry. Patricia smiled warmly. "The judge told me a little about your situation. He was very excited to meet with you properly. He said last night was unconventional. Before David could respond, the door to the chambers opened and Judge Williams emerged, no longer in his dinner attire, but wearing the black robes that commanded respect throughout the federal court system. Seeing him in his official capacity, David felt a moment of panic. Was he crazy to think he could work for someone this important? David. Judge Williams's face lit up with genuine warmth as he removed his robes and hung them on a wooden stand. Underneath, he wore a simple white shirt and conservative tie, professional, but somehow more approachable than David had expected. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please come in." The chambers were both imposing and comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes, a massive desk that looked like it had witnessed decades of important decisions, and two comfortable chairs positioned in front of tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. "Sit, please," Judge Williams gestured to one of the chairs as he settled into the other. "I want to start by saying that I don't usually conduct business this way. In fact, Patricia out there has been my clerk for 15 years, and she's never seen me offer someone a job based on a dinner conversation." David felt his stomach tighten. "Judge Williams, if you've reconsidered—" "Oh, I haven't reconsidered anything," Marcus interrupted with a chuckle. "If anything, I'm more convinced than ever that you're exactly what I need. But I realized I did this backwards. I offered you a position without explaining what the position actually entails." Relief flooded through David's chest. "I have to admit, I was curious about that." Judge Williams leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious, but no less warm. "David, I've been a federal judge for 23 years. In that time, I've accumulated ... well, let's call it a diverse portfolio of investments. Some inherited from my father, some acquired through what I like to think of smart decisions." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I own 17 properties across Chicago and the suburbs. Residential buildings, mostly, but also 2 small office complexes and a retail center in Oak Park. For years, I'd been using a property management company, but ... Marcus shook his head in frustration. "They're expensive, they're impersonal, and frankly, they don't share my values about how tenants should be treated." David found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested despite his nervousness. 6 months ago, I fired them. Since then, I've been handling everything myself, and it's become clear that I need someone I can trust, someone who understands both the business side and the human side of property management. Marcus stood and walked to his desk, returning with a thick folder. "These are the properties, David. Current rental income is about $200,000 per month. The management company was taking 15% off the top, plus charging tenants additional fees for basic maintenance requests." David's eyes widened. $200,000 per month meant Marcus Williams was managing a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. "The salary I mentioned, $120,000. That's just the beginning," Marcus continued. "I'm looking for a partner, not just an employee. Someone who can help me expand the portfolio while maintaining the standards I believe in." He opened the folder and spread several documents across the small table between them. "I've been watching you, David. Not just last night, but for years. I've seen how you handle the maintenance issues at the courthouse. You don't just fix problems, you prevent them. I've noticed that you're always respectful to everyone, from senior judges to the newest clerks." Marcus pulled out a sheet of paper and handed it to David. "But more importantly, I had my assistant do some research on your properties. Your tenant retention rate is 97%, David. 97%. Do you know what the average is in Chicago?" David shook his head. still processing the fact that a federal judge had researched his business practices. 62%, Marcus said. Your tenants stay because you treat them fairly. You maintain the properties properly, and you solve problems instead of creating them. That's exactly what I need. David looked down at the paper in his hands, a detailed analysis of his 3 buildings, including financial performance, maintenance records, and tenant satisfaction surveys he didn't even know had been conducted. Judge Williams, how did you get all this information? Marcus smiled. I have friends in the property management business. They were very impressed with your operation, by the way. One of them called you the landlord a landlord should learn from. The weight of the opportunity was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to build something significant, to use everything he had learned over the past 8 years on a much larger scale. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I mentioned that my mother cleaned offices when I was growing up. What I didn't mention is that she was often treated poorly by the people whose offices she cleaned. Not everyone, but enough that it left an impression on me. He paused, looking out the window at the city below. Last night, watching that woman humiliate you, I saw my mother. I saw every hard-working person who's ever been made to feel small by someone who confuses having money with having worth. And I realized that I've spent my career fighting for justice in courtrooms, but I haven't been doing enough to create justice in my own business practices. Marcus turned back to David, his expression intense but kind. I want to build something different, David. Properties where tenants are treated with dignity, where maintenance requests are handled promptly and fairly, where rent increases are reasonable and justified. I want to prove that you can be profitable and ethical at the same time. David felt something shifting inside him, not just excitement about the opportunity, but recognition of something he had always believed but never been able to articulate. Judge Williams, David said slowly, that's exactly the kind of business I have always wanted to run, but I never thought I'd have the chance to do it on this scale. You'll have that chance, David. But there's one more thing. Marcus reached into the folder and pulled out a contract. I've had my attorney draw up a partnership agreement. If you accept this position after 2 years of successful performance, you'll have the option to purchase a 20% stake in the portfolio at fair market value. David's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the contract. A 20% stake in a portfolio generating $200,000 monthly would be worth. David, are you all right? Marcus asked with concern. I'm just processing, David managed. Judge Williams, this is incredibly generous, but I have to ask, you could hire someone with an MBA from Northwestern, someone with years of experience managing large portfolios. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You know what's funny, David? I did hire someone with an MBA from Northwestern once, 3 years ago, for a different position. Harvard MBA, actually. Impeccable credentials, impressive references. What happened? He embezzled $40,000 and treated my tenants like they were at inconvenience to his profit margins. Marcus's expression grew serious. Credentials are important, David, but character is everything. And character isn't something you can teach or learn from a textbook. David looked down at the contract again, then back at Marcus. Judge Williams, I accept your offer, but I have one condition. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What's that? I want to visit every property personally before I start. I want to meet the tenants, understand their concerns, see what needs to be done. If I'm going to be responsible for their homes, I need to know what that responsibility really means. Marcus Williams smiled, the same smile he had worn the night before when he sat down at David's table uninvited. David Rodriguez. That answer tells me everything I need to know, about whether I made the right choice. As they shook hands, David realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't even fully comprehend yet. But he also realized something else. This partnership was going to change Marcus Williams' life too, in ways the judge probably hadn't anticipated. What neither of them knew was that across town, Sarah Mitchell was about to make a decision that would bring their story full circle in the most unexpected way possible. 2 weeks after the partnership agreement was signed, David Rodriguez stood in the lobby of Riverside Towers, one of Judge Williams' premier residential buildings in Lincoln Park. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating marble floors that sparkled under professional lighting. This was a far cry from his modest Southside properties, but the principles remained the same: happy tenants, well-maintained facilities, and respect for everyone who called the building home. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the building's longtime concierge, greeted him with the same warm smile she'd offered every day since he'd started his new position. "Good morning, Mr. Rodriguez. The Johnsons in 12B wanted to thank you personally for how quickly you handled their heating issue yesterday." David smiled back. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Hartwell. How are things with your grandson's college applications?" The fact that David remembered personal details about the staff had not gone unnoticed. In just 2 weeks, he had transformed the atmosphere of every building he managed. Where the previous management company had treated maintenance requests like inconveniences, David treated them like opportunities to improve someone's quality of life. But what David didn't know was that his reputation was about to be tested in a way he never could have anticipated. "Mr. Rodriguez." A young woman's voice behind him was tentative, almost nervous. David turned to see a petite brunette in an expensive business suit, holding a leather portfolio and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Something about her seemed familiar, but he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "Yes, I'm David Rodriguez. How can I help you?" The woman took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something difficult. "My name is Jessica Chun. I'm a leasing agent with Premier Properties Group. I represent a client who's very interested in renting a unit in this building." David nodded politely. "Of course. Do you have an appointment? I can show you what's available." Jessica's discomfort seemed to increase. "Actually, Mr. Rodriguez, there's something I need to tell you first. Something about my client that might complicate things." Before David could ask what she meant, the building's front door opened and his blood ran cold. Walking through the entrance, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, was Sarah Mitchell. Sarah removed her sunglasses, and for a moment, neither she nor David moved. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough that Mrs. Hartwell looked up from her desk with concern. "Hello, David," Sarah said finally, her voice lacking the confidence and cruelty it had carried 2 weeks ago at Romano's. David's first instinct was to ask her to leave. His second was to call security. But his third instinct, the one shaped by years of his father's teachings and reinforced by his daughter's wisdom, was to treat her with the same professionalism he would show any potential tenant. "Miss Mitchell," he replied evenly. "This is ... unexpected." Jessica Churn stepped forward, clearly mortified. "Mr. Rodriguez, I had no idea about your history with Miss Mitchell when she hired me. She only told me this morning, and I offered to find her a different agent. But she insisted." "It's fine, Jessica," Sarah interrupted, her voice softer than David had ever heard it. "Mr. Rodriguez, could I speak with you privately, please?" David looked around the elegant lobby, acutely aware that Mrs. Hartwell and Jessica were watching this interaction with fascination. Whatever Sarah wanted to say, this wasn't the place for it. "My office is upstairs," David said carefully. "But I should tell you, Miss Mitchell, that any application will be processed through the same procedures as every other potential tenant." "I understand," Sarah replied. That's part of what I wanted to talk to you about." David led Sarah and Jessica to the elevator, his mind racing. What could Sarah possibly want? Was this some kind of elaborate revenge for the humiliation she'd suffered at Romano's? Or was there something else at play? His office on the 3rd floor was modest but professional, a space that Judge Williams had insisted David design according to his own preferences. The walls were decorated with photos of his buildings and a framed picture of Alina at her Dean's List ceremony. His business degree hung beside a simple wooden cross that had belonged to his late wife. "Please sit." David gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Sarah sat down, but Jessica remained standing, clearly wanting to be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah began, her hands folded tightly in her lap, "I need to start by apologizing for my behavior at dinner. There's no excuse for how I treated you." David studied her face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. But what he saw instead was something he hadn't expected: genuine remorse. "I appreciate the apology," David said carefully, "but that doesn't explain why you're here." Sarah took a shaky breath. "Because my life fell apart after that night, and I finally understood what you tried to tell me about dignity and hard work." The room fell, silent, except for the distant hum of traffic from the street below. "What do you mean?" David asked. "I mean that Judge Williams wasn't the only person who heard our conversation that night." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone at the restaurant recorded part of it on their phone. By the next morning, it was all over social media." David felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of recording?" Jessica Chun spoke up for the first time since they'd entered the office. "Mr. Rodriguez, the video shows Ms. Mitchell saying some very harsh things about working-class people. It went viral within 48 hours. Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I lost my job, David. My employer said they couldn't have someone representing their brand who showed such callous disregard for working families. The marketing firm that was going to hire me rescinded their offer. My apartment building even asked me to move out because other tenants were complaining." David stared at her, processing this information. The woman who had humiliated him so publicly was now facing consequences he wouldn't wish on anyone. "I've been staying in hotels for the past week," Sarah continued. "I have applied for dozens of jobs, but every time they Google my name, that video comes up. I'm essentially unemployable in my field." She wiped her eyes with a tissue, her voice growing stronger. "But you know what the worst part is? It took losing everything for me to realize that you were right, about dignity, about the value of honest work, about what really matters." David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Sarah, I'm sorry you're going through this, but I still don't understand why you're here. Because I want to start over," she said, her voice gaining conviction. "I want to find a place to live where I can rebuild my life, and I want to learn how to be the kind of person who deserves respect instead of demanding it." Jessica Chern pulled out a folder from her portfolio. "Miss Mitchell has excellent credit, substantial savings, and she is prepared to pay 6 months' rent in advance. She's looking for a 1-bedroom unit, nothing fancy." David looked at the application Jessica handed him. Sarah's financial information was impressive. Clearly, she had been well compensated in her previous position. But what struck him was a handwritten note at the bottom of the application. "I know I don't deserve your consideration," the note read, "but I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to prove that people can change. I want to be your tenant, not because I think I'm entitled to it, but because I believe living in a building managed by someone with integrity might help me become a better person. Sarah Mitchell. David set the application down and looked directly at Sarah. You understand that if you live in one of our buildings, you'll be subjected to the same community standards as everyone else. We have residents from all walks of life here: teachers, firefighters, retirees on fixed incomes. Can you treat them with respect? David, Sarah's voice was steady now. 2 weeks ago, I thought respect was something people had to earn by making a certain amount of money or having the right job title. Now I understand that respect is something everyone deserves simply because they're human. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I know you have every reason to reject my application. I know I humiliated you, and I can't undo that. But I'm hoping, I'm hoping that maybe you believe in second chances. David thought about Elena, about the conversations they'd had about forgiveness and growth. He thought about Judge Williams, who had seen potential in a night janitor when no one else would. He thought about his late wife, Maria, who had always believed that people could change if they were given the opportunity. Miss Mitchell, David said finally, I'll review your application just like any other. But I need you to understand something. If you become a tenant in one of our buildings, you won't be Sarah Mitchell, who went viral for being cruel. You'll just be Sarah, a neighbor who deserves the same consideration as everyone else. Sarah's tears flowed freely now, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sadness. Thank you, David. That's all I wanted, a chance to be judged by who I can become, not who I was. As David processed Sarah's application over the following days, he found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. 2 weeks ago, he had been a night janitor, being humiliated by this woman. Now, he was in a position to either help her rebuild her life or deny her that opportunity. But what David didn't know was that his decision about Sarah's application would set in motion a chain of events that would test everything he believed about forgiveness, second chances, and the true meaning of justice. 3 days later, David Rodriguez sat in Judge Williams' chambers, holding Sarah Mitchell's completed application file. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to discuss the fate of the woman who had humiliated him in the very place where his life had been transformed by an act of unexpected kindness. You look troubled, David, Marcus observed, setting down his coffee cup. Is everything all right with the properties? David had requested this meeting under the pretense of discussing building operations, but the truth was more complicated. Over the past 72 hours, he'd wrestled with a decision that felt far bigger than whether to approve a rental application. Judge Williams, I need to tell you about something that's happened this week. Something that's making me question everything I thought I knew about justice and forgiveness. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of genuine concern. What's going on? David handed him the application file. Sarah Mitchell wants to rent an apartment in Riverside Towers. The judge's eyebrows shot up in surprise. The same Sarah Mitchell who, the same one, David confirmed. And the situation is ... complicated. Over the next 10 minutes, David recounted Sarah's visit, her apparent transformation, and the viral video that had destroyed her career. Marcus listened without interruption, his judicial training evident in the way he absorbed every detail without revealing his own thoughts. So what's the dilemma? Marcus asked when David finished. Her credit is good, she can afford the rent, and she's shown remorse for her behavior. Seems straightforward. David shook his head. It's not that simple. Judge Williams, I keep thinking about that night at Romano's, about how she made me feel worthless, how she called me the help. Part of me wants to deny her application, to to let her experience what it feels like to be rejected for who she is rather than what she can offer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in thought. And the other part of you, the other part of me remembers what you did that night. You could have just walked away, could have let her humiliate me and gone on with your evening. But you chose to intervene, not because you had to, but because it was the right thing to do. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. I keep asking myself, what's the right thing to do now? Is justice letting her face the consequences of her actions? Or is justice giving her the chance to become better? Marcus joined him at the window. David, let me tell you something I've learned in 23 years on the federal bench. Real justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. The question isn't whether Sarah Mitchell deserves a second chance. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't give her one. Before David could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Elena. Dad, I just saw the craziest thing on social media. That woman from your dinner date is trending again, but this time it's different. Call me. Judge Williams, I need to make a quick call, David said, showing him the message. Of course, use my office. David stepped into the adjacent room and dialed Eleanor's number. She answered on the first ring. Dad, you're not going to believe this. Someone just posted a follow-up video to that viral clip of Sarah Mitchell. It's her talking about what happened and apologizing publicly. But that's not the crazy part. David's heart began to race. What's the crazy part? She's donating $50,000 to a scholarship fund for children of working families. Dad, she mentioned you by name. She said you taught her that dignity isn't about what you do for work, but how you treat other people while you're doing it. David felt the air leave his lungs. She's what? There's more, Dad. She's volunteering at a community center, helping people write resumes and prepare for job interviews. She said she wants to spend the rest of her life making up for the pain she caused. When David returned to Marcus's office, the judge took one look at his face and said, "Good news or bad news?" "I honestly don't know," David replied, explaining what Elena had told him. Marcus smiled, the same smile he'd worn that night at Romano's when he'd sat down uninvited at their table. "David, I think Sarah Mitchell just answered your question about whether people can really change. But how do I know it's genuine? How do I know this isn't just an elaborate performance to rebuild her image?" "You don't," Marcus said simply. "But that's where faith comes in. Faith in the possibility that someone who's fallen as far as she has might actually want to climb back up." David looked down at the application in his hands. "Judge Williams, what would you do? But remember that 2 weeks ago, I was a federal judge having dinner alone, and you were a night janitor being humiliated by someone who didn't understand your worth. I'd remember that sometimes the most unlikely people become the catalysts for the most important changes in our lives." Marcus paused, his voice growing softer. "And I'd remember that the measure of a man isn't how he treats people who can help him, but how he treats people who can't." 30 minutes later, and David found himself back at Riverside Towers, holding an envelope that contained either Sarah Mitchell's lease agreement or her rejection letter. He had made his decision, but he wanted to deliver the news in person. Sarah was waiting in the lobby with Jessica Chern, her posture rigid with anxiety. When she saw David approaching, she stood up slowly, her face pale with anticipation. "Miss Mitchell," David said formally, "could I speak with you privately?" Sarah nodded, following him to a quiet corner of the lobby. Jessica remained behind, clearly as nervous as her client. "I've reviewed your application," David began, watching Sarah's face carefully. "Your financial qualifications are excellent, and your references check out." Sarah held her breath, waiting for the inevitable, but instead, David smiled. "Welcome to Riverside Towers, Miss Mitchell. You can move in next week." Sarah's knees actually buckled, and David had to steady her with his arm. You're saying yes." "I'm saying yes," David confirmed. "But I need you to understand something. This isn't charity, and it's not pity. You're getting this apartment because I believe people can change, and because someone recently taught me that sometimes the greatest act of justice is offering grace instead of revenge." Tears streaming down her face, Sarah managed to whisper, "Thank you, David. I promise I won't let you down." "Don't promise me," David replied gently. "Promise yourself, and promise the community you're about to join. They deserve your best self, not your apologies." As David handed her the lease agreement, Sarah looked at him with something approaching awe. "How do you do it? How do you find it in yourself to forgive someone who treated you so badly?" David thought about his daughter's wisdom, about Judge Williams' intervention, about his late wife's belief in the fundamental goodness of people. "I learned it from watching people who chose to see potential instead of problems. People who understood that helping others rise doesn't diminish you, it elevates everyone." 6 months later, David Rodriguez stood in the same lobby where Sarah Mitchell had nervously waited to learn her fate. But this time, he wasn't alone. Elena was with him, having just graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern and been accepted to 3 medical schools. Judge Williams was there too, along with Patricia Chun and several of the building's residents. They were celebrating the first anniversary of Rodriguez Property Management, which had grown to manage 23 buildings across Chicago and had become known throughout the city for its innovative approach to tenant relations. But the most surprising guest was Sarah Mitchell herself, who had just been hired as the non-profit coordinator for the Rodriguez Foundation, a charitable organization. David had started to provide housing assistance to working families. "You know what the best part of this story is?" Elena said to the assembled group, raising her glass of sparkling cider in a toast. "A year ago, my dad was emptying trash cans at the courthouse. Tonight, he's employing the woman who once called him the help." Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Elena's right, but she's missing the most important part. Your father didn't just give me a job, he gave me back my humanity. He showed me that real power isn't about having authority over others. It's about using whatever influence you have to lift people up." She turned to David, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude rather than shame. "David Rodriguez, you could have destroyed me when I was at my lowest point. Instead, you saved me. And in doing so, you showed me what true dignity looks like." Marcus Williams raised his own glass, his voice carrying the same authority it held in federal court. "To David Rodriguez, who proved that character isn't about where you start, it's about how you choose to treat people along the way. And to Sarah Mitchell, who discovered that redemption isn't something you can buy or manipulate, it's something you have to earn, one day at a time." As the applause filled the elegant lobby of Riverside Towers, David looked around at the faces of people whose lives had been touched by a simple decision to choose grace over revenge, potential over problems, and faith over fear. The night janitor, who had been humiliated at Romano's, was gone. In his place stood a successful businessman, devoted father, and living example of the truth that dignity isn't something anyone can take away from you. It's something you carry within yourself, regardless of what others choose to see. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you hold on to that dignity long enough, the whole world begins to see it too. This is what happens when good people choose grace over revenge, when second chances meet genuine change, and when dignity recognizes dignity. If this story moved you, Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because stories of transformation and forgiveness need to be shared across every corner of our world. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us what really matters in life.